Welcome to Eurodollar University with Jeff Snyder. My name is Emil Kalinowski, and we are joined by a repeat guest. Jeff, deep in my old age now, I don't know if my memory is working very well, but is Izabella Kaminska our first repeat guest ever?
Yeah, she is. And I think that's appropriate because as a longtime editor of FT Alphaville, she has been, in the mainstream media at least, one of the few people who we respect and really would invite on our show a second time. So it's great to have her back.
Izabella, you are on top of the journalistic world, business media, financial press, the Financial Times, great reputation. You were an editor there, Alphaville, everyone's favorite part of FT. This year, you left to go somewhere else, the Dash Second Media. Is that correct? Tell us about it. Why did you do it?
So I've actually changed the name. It's now the Dash Blind Spot. And Second Media is still something I'm trying to do, but it's phase two of the plan. The plan, like Elon Musk's plan. No, not like Elon Musk. I'm just joking. But yeah. So I mean, I love the FT, and I mean when I was there, they really schooled me in so much of my journalistic, education, and I am very privileged to have experienced that, and there's no hard feelings at all. But I think the nature of communications these days is changing in very weird and distorting ways. I think the mainstream press has been constrained in some ways. I don't think it's like a conscious thing. I think lots of people are very oblivious to it. But I felt that what Alphaville was doing specifically was no longer tenable at the FT, and that's a function of lots of different things. It's really also about the era we are in now and what you can and cannot get away with. Alphaville was sort of set up to be very quick fire analysis, a bit speculative, moving where people are, covering topics that are being overlooked in the mainstream. And I think the mood now is not really as tolerant of experimentation or looking at other perspectives. Very often we would get things wrong. I'm not saying we didn't, but I think as you don't really learn in markets, especially if you don't look at the full picture. And it's really important to be able to consider different perspectives, because if you don't, you end up with a blind spot, hence the name. With the blind spot, I'm trying to kind of create, very dispassionate analysis that, just because we're looking at the other perspective doesn't mean we necessarily agree with it, but you can't just like filter it out, in my opinion. So that's the short and tall of it. But I have a second plan, which is also to kind of try and add credibility to the independent press, because I think very, very, quickly, I'll just say that obviously the mainstream has a reputation, a credibility, but I think there's also a mismatch between the values of the newspapers and the employees sometimes. And whereas that used to be managed from the top down, and people would repress their instincts because they were trying, for example, if you're trying to get into a very competitive business, you'll take any job. You won't necessarily want to write about, I don't know, ETFs or, crypto, but you'll do it just to get into the industry, right? And that used to not be a problem. But I think in these days, because of how the internet is organizing, people don't feel very happy about the values of the organization they're working in, rally together to try and change things from the inside. And that's all fine and well in politics and capturing politicians and like momentum here in labor or whatever. But I think in news, it's really, for readers, it's very disingenuous, because readers are coming to you for a specific masthead promise, right? So if you are the FT or the Wall Street Journal or Business Focus, that promise is a cool, sober look at markets that is not emotionally charged with political perspectives. I mean, that has always been the tradition of the financial press. I think everything has become increasingly politicized, and as a result, you lose that overview. So I want to bring the values of the journalist in line with the masthead proposition. So I'm kind of trying to sponsor this idea of values-centered journalism and create a marketplace for codes of conduct, so that people know what they're getting. And my general principle is that the idea that bias can never be eliminated is really silly. I think neutrality is kind of impossible, but it's not bad. Like as long as you're transparent about the biases you have and live by a code of conduct and can be policed and take, held to account to your code of conduct, I don't think it's a problem. But that's the sort of culture I want to engineer at the Blind Spot, and then beyond the Blind Spot, have the Blind Spot sort of champion these values in independent media, so that we can, basically reconfigure how information is organized online.
Isn't that funny though, Izzy, that, you say about challenging policing bias. One of the ways that you should do that, I think you should do that, is by being open to other opinions and other points of view, right? I mean, I have my own view of the world, but, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't have all the information. So by shutting everybody else out, you're sort of doing not just, you're doing your audience a disservice, you're doing yourself a disservice too.
Completely agree. And I think in the modern day culture, it's become like almost sacrilegious to question whether you might be wrong,
exactly.
Right? And I think, every morning I wake up and I go, am I wrong about this? And that's how I've changed my view on things. And I do change my views. And some people say, oh, you flopped on this and you flipped. And I do, because I think context matters, and what's right in some circumstances, and, that's the right thing to do at that point, isn't always the right thing to do in a different circumstance. So I don't think there should be any shame in changing your position and in questioning, is my position correct on this? That's how we learn. So, yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to ask Izabella what she's working on. I know that she's extremely busy right now, and all of you can follow along by going several places. On Twitter, at The Blind Spot, and that O is a 0. Is that right, Izabella?
Yes, because the other ones were taken.
You can also find...
You didn't cyber spot years ago in anticipation of this move.
Yeah, but when I'm hugely successful, I'll make an offer for the real one.
Also, at Iza Kaminski, IZAKAMINSKA, and then online, the-blindspot.com. Izabella, you said you're extremely busy writing right now about where finance, econ, and media intersect with reality. What are you writing about right now at the Blind Spot?
So I was obviously everything that's going on in Ukraine is on my radar, and I had for a long while I had been sort of concerned about escalation in that area, and also how markets were not pricing it in. My initial newsletter on February 6th, even though today it's kind of obvious, on February 6th, if you were kind of like saying there's some sort of World War III watch risk, that was still absurd on February 6th. That's how quickly the norms have changed. And what has happened is that just as we had to learn about epidemiology overnight when COVID struck, everyone's become an armchair military tactician, right? But the market, like people in the markets are learning. And what I found with COVID was that you have to kind of guide people along with you. I'm learning, the market's learning, we learn together, because if you're a trader, you can't just read, Sun Tzu or like, you're not going to have time to digest that. Market events are going quicker than you can digest like a lifetime's worth of academic work, right? So you need to distill things, and sometimes the problem is with the serious kind of professional specialist press is that they're speaking to specialists, and traders are kind of generalists who have to kind of quickly learn about stuff. So I'm trying to cater to that and have us learn together, so people don't feel in some ways sort of patronized or distanced from what's going on. So I'm learning, they're learning, and hopefully together we will try and come up with some actionable intelligence that can help us figure things out. And, my big take in war, because I actually hail from media studies, which used to be journalism studies, actually, my dissertations were always about propaganda and about, the first casualty of war is truth. So I'm very conscious of how information is being controlled right now. And as I was at the Polish embassy, not the embassy, a club yesterday with the Polish ambassador, amongst others. And there was a big discussion about whether, would you have platformed Stalin? Like, would you have interviewed Stalin back in the day? And this is apparently a debate going on in Poland, and there's a big sort of, it's related to the fact that the Russian ambassador has been deplatformed. And some people are saying, well, you shouldn't deplatform him because we need to know what they're thinking. And then there's lots of people going, no, you can't, you can't give someone like that a platform. And I was arguing the case that actually you do need to give them a platform, because you in financial markets, like, it's not just military and boots and whatever that win wars, it's capital allocation. If you hit Reuters, Wall Street Journal, whatever, like, some of the biggest fortunes were made from reading the war results correctly, right? So if you are believing your own disinformation, even if it is white propaganda for the sake of morale, or I understand why they're doing it, as an investor, you can't afford to believe your own white propaganda, because the blowback is that you will, like, it'll have serious implications. You might end up underspending on energy or national security, like the Germans, right? So if you think you're doing better in the war, or your friends are really, your enemies are really your friends, you will create exposures which then can be leveraged by the other side. So I'm saying that it is actually a national duty to look at all perspectives if you're an investor, because not losing money is actually part of the war game. So that's my take on that. So no, we should definitely interview Starling, because you need to know what he's thinking. But maybe you disagree.
It's an unsettling trend, Izabella. That's what concerns me most, is we can't just consider the question of whether or not we should have RTTV being broadcast, or whether or not we should pull it off the air in isolation, because we started out in the United States pulling off Alex Jones, and I said nothing because I'm not a conspiracist. And then we pulled the president off Twitter, and I said nothing because I'm not an orange person. But now truckers are not allowed to talk about what they're interested in. Now the entire Russian national population in media not allowed to be discussed in and what their perspectives are. I'm just worried eventually that one day when they come after us, Jeff, there will be no one left to speak for the Eurodollar voices.
Well, there's hardly any of those to begin with, so I'm not sure. Nobody's going to miss us.
Well, I mean, this is the most fascinating time to talk about Eurodollars, frankly.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you a lot of questions, Jeff, as well. But just on that, I was definitely on board with this whole, like, anti-deplatforming thing. I'm just wondering now, knowing what we know, like the speculation in the Polish, I know the Polish are going to you're Polish, so you will know that we have a tendency to overreact about things related to World War II.
Russians or Germans.
Yeah, yes. You have a lot of good reasons for that. So,
And we have a lot of good reasons to do that. And certainly I'm hoping that the Polish reaction is over the top. But I fear, the talk in the Polish City Club last night was very much that, maybe the Cold War never ended. Maybe the kleptocrats who controlled, the Soviet Union in the end days, maybe they've lost their Marxist ideology, but maybe their aspiration to be conquistadors of Europe and the wider world, that maybe was never suppressed. Maybe they've been playing a very long game, and maybe it's not just Putin. Maybe it's a bigger kind of problem with infiltration. And I think in that context, I'm trying to think, can I give our side the benefit of the doubt? Maybe, what I, as an completely ignorant party in this, all I know is that people were lying to me and there was conflicting information out there. And when you questioned it, effectively, like, shutting people down is a very blunt tool, which only makes them more suspicious. So if it was about, like, controlling things for national security with the Canadian truckers or whatever, if that's really the case, I think it's a silly mechanism, because it's actually just ended up causing more distrust, and censorship doesn't work in a polarized environment, because the people who don't agree with you are just going to think there's a conspiracy. If in a more homogeneous environment, I think it can work as a tactic, but I don't know. Who knows? I have no insight.
How much denial do you think the mainstream media is in? Because, what you're just saying is actually, I mean, the more they try to censor, the more they try to, narrow discourse down into acceptable limits, the more people are going to turn to alternative outlets. And that's really, the internet has opened up all the opportunities for all, to people to speak and broadcast their views. So people like you and people like Emil and I can get these alternative ideas into a wide arena, potentially a wide arena. So, I have to wonder, if is the legacy media really in that much denial about the state of affairs, about the fact that we're going through a period of very disruptive technology, very disruptive social norms, where, the media landscape itself 5 years from now, maybe even sooner than that, is going to look very, very different. It already has, right? Just over the last, little while, things have changed a lot. In some ways, I think it's maybe it's understandable, because when your business model starts to go wrong, you just you laser focus on your past business model, because sometimes it's easier just to do what you always did, rather than realize that maybe you need to open yourself up to radical change.
No, look, that was my analysis definitely up until 2 weeks ago, and I just think now, in the spirit of, am I wrong? Like, if it turns out that this was all for like national security, and maybe, a lot of it was cultural, so I don't necessarily think it was for national security, but I do wonder if there was, maybe that in itself is the wrong take. But I definitely agree that what was going on was sinister, that people were being, in a democracy, that shouldn't happen. Now, is it fair to suspend like freedom of speech to some degree during wartime? I think possibly that is justified, although I think it should still be compartmentalized. Like, you might know that like in Maoist China, there were always two news sources. There was the news source for the masses, which was like all the, propaganda, but the elite had the truth, which had all the warts and, bad stuff in it, because they couldn't afford not to like be aware of what was really going on. And I do wonder if that has been what has been going on a little bit. And so for the masses, we've seen, within media itself, you have two kind of, you've got the people who are just following the pack, the pack journalists, and they're just going to amplify, and it's incredibly kind of mind-numbing for me. And as a natural contrarian, I respond like when I see a pattern of propaganda, of like people just mindlessly repeating stuff without thinking about it, it makes me concerned that I'm missing something.
Izabella, a moment. I'm sorry to interrupt. Sorry. I was just going to say, before the Ukraine situation, there was a gigantic, wonderful example that would take a lifetime of study to dissect regarding propaganda and misinformation. And that was COVID, the vaccines, the government response, 2 years, and the media seemingly trumpeting just one particular solution or path and not allowing other voices to speak up. Before we had Ukraine, this seems like it would have been grist for the mill. What were you writing at the Blind Spot about that particular propaganda push? And it's amazing how we haven't learned from that just 2 weeks later.
For me, I don't understand how in a democracy you can have a go at people for questioning things. Like, for me, debate is part of the process of learning. And when science starts to just come down on one perspective and refuses and literally silences or drowns out the other perspective, and I was speaking to scientists, whatever, and they can't all be nutters. They can't all be conspiracy theories. There's just too many people critiquing it. They can't all be mental. And yet and then I was hearing about people just not being able to speak, for fear of like recriminations on their jobs, etc. Didn't sound to me like a kind of healthy environment for science. And if that's the case, if what else is going on, and how can you trust, this whole idea of scientism? And obviously I'm not a scientist, so I can only go with what the experts say. But when people are drowning out one perspective versus the other, I don't think that's science. So that made me suspicious in and of itself. And with respect to COVID, I think in the mandates, especially, and the Canadian situation, it became really very, very strange to me that you couldn't, peaceful protest is a fundamental right in a democracy. And I could see that they were smearing it's exactly what Putin's doing, by the way. Like, so now Putin is going around saying that all the Ukrainians are Nazis. He's using the same playbook. When you're saying, oh, well, all the Canadian truckers are Nazis or whatever, and right-wing extremists, well, you can see with your own eyes that's not true, and you can see it's with your own eyes that's not true in Ukraine as well. So I think what we've learned is, I think it also was an exercise in like how we control money flow. And when the Canadian thing was happening, I did think to myself, this is a precursor for like banning accounts and seizing property in London for like Russian money. That was the thought that occurred to me. So yeah, I mean, those are my thoughts. I wasn't very happy with it. I think it was overstepped the mark, and I think it lost people trust. But then I know there's another perspective, and the other perspective, when you talk to the other people, they see it as totally legitimate, and they see it as like, they've got this war mentality of like, well, we were in a war against COVID, we've got to do what matters, we've got to all take sacrifices. And it's the libertarian kind of individualism versus the collective. That's the clash, I think, in the system.
But isn't there, it's a little bit bigger than that, right? Because I think in some sense we've lost the idea of what science actually is, right? In some ways we've confused science with authority, and it's not supposed to be that way. Science is supposed to be, here's a bunch of evidence, we're going to evaluate the evidence and come to reasonable conclusions, which we can argue about because the evidence, especially in something like a social science, is never 100% clear. So there always should be some kind of robust debate anyway, and then maybe there's a consensus. And I think what happened, Emil and I run into this all the time, is that people have been taught to believe science is the authoritarian picture of a person who has a very important job. We don't know what the job is. It's very important because look at the setting that they're in. They've got, these Roman columns and a fancy chair and all these other things. As long as these people look authoritative, we're supposed to just believe that they're the science. They have done all the work, and they have done it on our behalf, so that we don't have to evaluate the evidence because it's beyond our capabilities. Let's let the experts take care of it. And that's what you just said. Let's listen to the experts, and the experts will tell us what expert opinion says about the expert way to do things. And at some point we got to say, well, what makes these people the experts? Are they actually experts, or do they just have a job that makes them look like experts? And I think there's two problems here. The public has been led to believe experts are experts, and therefore, they have all the right credentials. They went to the right schools. They've had the right jobs. Therefore, they must know what they're talking about. And on the other side of the coin, experts become more just interested in maintaining their sinecure than they do actually advancing the public discourse.
I completely agree, and I think what's going on in academia is really troubling. Again, I've always made comparisons to the Soviet Union, which is apt now more than ever. But like, this is precisely what happened in the Soviet Union. So like, when I give the West the benefit of the doubt, and I think, well, maybe they're doing all these things, maybe they know, maybe these experts know that what they're doing is wrong, or they're giving disinfo, or they're trying to manage expectations or whatever, and they're doing it for a better purpose, but for a higher purpose. But they, because they're smart, they really do know what it's all part of like a logical strategy. That's the benefit of the doubt, like behavioral science and all that. But the concern I have is that actually it's just another expression of the sort of corruption that hit the Soviet Union, where people were elevated to positions not because of what they knew, but who they knew. The entire educational system was broken down, and it became a pay-as-you-go access situation where the qualifications you got were often meaningless. Now, people always challenge me on that point. Oh, well, the Soviet Union produced loads of scientists, they're all very good, and physicists, blah, blah, blah. And that is true to a degree, but they excelled in the sort of like in the disciplines where like book learning, where you just learn, and like engineering, very, very excellent sort of engineers coming out of the Soviet Union, absolutely. But that's not really what I would call the thinking disciplines, right? Obviously physics is, and there are great Russian physicists, but very often they excelled outside of the system and within the kind of more conventional world. Like my mum had an economic degree from SGH, which is like the Polish LSE, and she was embarrassed to use it in the UK because she felt that economics, taught under Marxism, under a Marxist perspective, was like bullshit, right? It wasn't really correct. So she felt like it was like just, that's a meaningless degree. And secondly, she wasn't proud of it. And secondly, she just thought it was, well, the other thing she would say is that she would see how like people who are on her course wouldn't admit to that and then just use the piece of paper as an access mechanism. And they all arrived at very high level positions, but she knew them from like back in the day, and she knew, oh, these people, they don't know what they're talking about, right? So those are the two things, right? So which one is it? I don't know, and I worry that it might be some of the latter.
Izabella, what questions do you have for Jeff? Swift, chips, chaps.
Well, I want Swift. I mean, is this okay? First of all, is this the end of the petrodollar? Like, what are you? That's like, there's all sorts of like armchair Eurodollar, petrodollar people talking out there, but you are the definitive expert on the topic. I want to know what your thoughts are.
The whole SWIFT thing has sort of revealed the level of economic and monetary illiteracy that pervades even the expert class, because I think there's this idea that SWIFT equals dollar. Therefore, if we cut some Russian banks off of SWIFT, they're screwed. They're completely out of the White House statement over the weekend basically said, we're cutting the Russian banks out of the international financial system. And then, of course, everybody just repeats this over and over again. And I'm like, SWIFT is nothing more than a messaging system. That's all. It's a text message system. It's a telex. It's a modern version of a telex system. So, we're cutting 10 Russian banks off of SWIFT, which means they'll not have to use a telephone. It's not cutting them out of the financial system. You can understand why why not just the U.S., but all the allied countries that are allying with Ukraine are doing this, because they want to make it seem like we're not powerless. We do have some form of authority over Putin where we can really hurt the guy. When the truth is, again, it reveals the level of monetary illiteracy that, we can't cut the Russians out of the dollar system any more than we can cut anybody out, because the dollar system is an organic, offshore, bank-centered, very dispersed ledger system that, the U.S., the Treasury Department can't just order this person or this government or this bank outside of it, because it's a network. And if you start to play around in one part of the network, what networks are really good at is rerouting traffic into other parts. So we're going to cut 10 banks out of SWIFT. They're going to find other means of accessing the dollar system to begin with. But really, it reveals the level of, the experts all said that this was a big deal, when in fact it is not. And I think the public has some inclination that this is more optics than it is any kind of meaningful punishment for Russia's activities. And really, the bigger picture here is that it's not government that controls money. And therefore, the issue isn't really the petrodollar. The issue is the Eurodollar, which is money is a private affair amongst the global banking system that maintains the ledger system. So that's really, if there's some kind of slight positive here, that maybe we'll get and it's a very tiny one, it's the smallest sliver of a silver lining, is that maybe people will learn a little bit more about how the dollar system actually works, and therefore start to connect some of these dots.
So do you think, because obviously with the Eurodollar system, there's now a inflation concern as well as everything else. Do you think that it's going to be like a beauty competition, like we're going to be the best of a bad bunch, or what's your like relative? Obviously the ruble has totally collapsed, but so you it sounds to me like you think the dollar will prevail despite the inflationary concerns and all everything that's hitting.
Well, that's what the inflationary concerns are amongst the experts. It's not actually in the marketplace. And I know this is hard for many people to believe.
Well, no, I read your piece, and I would love to hear more, because I want to understand. So you're saying the market is not pricing in inflation the way the experts
not
are.
At all, not any bit, not even a little bit. And so all the experts are running around saying inflationary currency, inflation, the dollar, all this stuff, and the actual dollar system is saying, what are you talking about? There's no inflation here. Yeah, consumer prices are up, but that's not the same thing. What we're not seeing an excess of money creation in the actual system. We're seeing something very different. And the way it comes out very different is, as oil prices, for example, go higher, that creates more pain. It makes the economy unhealthier. which eventually leads to its downfall. So the market is actually pricing the downside of what happened last year in consumer prices. And in money terms, it's looking ahead as if the 2020s will be worse than the 2010s in terms of growth and inflation expectations, as if that was somehow possible. So the actual monetary system is saying to you, inflation? What are you talking about, inflation?
So basically, the idea is that we'll have an overcorrection of oil prices, which will then create mass demand destruction and basically make everyone not spend any money. And presumably, if there is a war, that's not going to be good for consuming because that's going to kill consumption.
Right. You have a lot of people that say wars are inflationary because it raises commodity prices. Things are hard to move around. But the other side of the equation is just exactly what you said. Usually demand falls faster than supply gets restricted on commodities. So you have more demand destruction than any kind of upward pressure from commodity prices. So yeah, even if this conflict in Ukraine and Russia starts to spread, that's even more deflationary than not.
So basically, if we all end up in a future where we're sitting in nuclear bunkers every other day, that's not very good for consumption.
Yeah, exactly. You sure as hell aren't going to be taking risk, which is what the modern economies absolutely need. They need risk-taking behavior. And so if you look at the balance of probabilities across all of these marketplaces, no wonder their curves are so flat and looking as bad as they are, is because there are so many downside risks. And not just, we can set aside Russia and Ukraine, we can set aside, all these other concerns. Just, maybe the economy wasn't as robust last year as all the experts said it was. Maybe the recovery was masked by what happened in consumer prices. We had somewhat of a money illusion, which actually was a price illusion based on the supply shock. Maybe the global economy is in worse shape than anybody really believes entering 2022. And now we have all this other stuff to worry about.
And what do you think about kind of the crypto class? Like, what do you think? Is there any kind of, is it going to be bullish or bearish or any, the Bitcoin bulls are very pro-war. They think it's very good for Bitcoin.
I'm always, digital currencies in general and decentralized financialization, all that stuff, I think is bullish over the long run. But I think in the short run, I'm still convinced that most people have piled into digital currencies, Bitcoin, crypto, whatever, based on the wrong idea. The idea that the Fed has destroyed the dollar and therefore it's going to go to zero. And we all need to protect ourselves in a store of value kind of way, when in fact, as Emil and I talk about all the time, what's opened the door for digital currencies and allowed them to proliferate and become successful is medium of exchange potential. The Eurodollar system is broken. It's inelastic. It's unsuited. It's unsuitable for the needs of the global economy. And therefore, the global economy is starting to pull itself apart. And in doing so, it is searching for alternative means of currency elasticity, which digital currencies in a future day, in a future form, may be able to supply. Not yet. I don't think they're available yet. Certainly not in the scale that we need them to. So long run, I think there's a role for digital currencies, but not in their current forms or in their current incarnations. Got to go through a couple of steps of evolution between now and then. And so it's not about store of value. The dollar's not going to zero. In fact, over the last year, what happened? CPIs in the US went up, CPIs in Europe went up, and the dollar went up too. How can that possibly be? Because it's something else is going on in the actual monetary system. And it's a clash between what the public is told to believe by all the experts and what they can actually see with their lying eyes, right? The dollar's supposed to be going to zero. Inflation's out of control, yet the dollar's exchange value keeps going higher. Something is not right here.
Yes, and presumably there's nothing like a potential nuclear war to put the fiat into the fiat, right?
Exactly. Yeah, right.
So, I mean, at the end of the day, that is the ultimate kind of base value in the fiat system, is the show of strength and who protects the free system or whatever. So theoretically, but I wonder what do you think Russia? Do you think Russia will be championing Bitcoin? Do you think it will be? So if it's so your take is that, as far as I understand, they'll still be deploying dollars, they'll still need dollars, but will they be trying to shift into alternative classes or yuan or any other? What do you think they'll be doing?
The Russians have been trying to move, as the Chinese have been trying to deal with their dollar problem for a very long time. It's just they can't. I mean, they're kind of stuck here. The reserve currency is the reserve currency, and there's really not much you can do about it unless you're willing to create a competing structure. But let's face it, China and Russia don't make for the most acceptable masthead for a reserve currency regime outside of that immediate bloc. It's not like they can immediately say, okay, we're tired of the dollar. We're going to create a yuan ruble kind of mixture, and we're going to go head to head with the US dollar. Well, number one, the US dollar is not the reserve currency. The Eurodollar is, and there's all sorts of infrastructure. There's all sorts of institutional inertia attached to it. This SWIFT episode is a very good example of the fact that, there's a hell of a lot more here than just messages going back and forth. And that so any kind of competing currency structure that has any hope of absorbing the roles of a reserve currency, it's got a hell of a lot of work to do. It's going to take a hell of a lot of time and a hell of a lot of resources and commitment to get it done. And I don't think Putin has done himself any favors here in trying to create some kind of, expand trust in his monetary efforts, because at the end of the day, money is all about trust. And in some ways, it's not trust in political authorities. It's trust that, well, it just kind of works, right? If I want to trade with Japan, or I want to trade between Japan and Sweden, how do I intermediate that? I just need something that works. How can I go from yen to kroner? I mean, I just need something in the middle that I can depend on. It's not about the politics. It's not about the US. It's not about even, oil. It's just about intermediation. And sometimes the most basic level of trust is it just seems to work.
I'm just wondering, in that context, obviously, I think as you say, it's also the neutrality of money that really gives it its value. But do you think post-Canadian truckers and potential, there's one thing kicking Russia out of SWIFT, but it's another potentially seizing assets, right? If we start dipping into say Russian central bank reserves, or Afghanistan, we also have seen the Afghan reserves being potentially redistributed to 9/11 victims by fiat, effectively. So if that becomes the norm, do you think that risks any reputational damage?
Yeah, I think that opens the door to private competing currencies, right? I mean, that's what digital currencies are about. How do we make our money and our assets unconfiscatable, if that's a word? How can we shelter our assets and maintain some form of anonymity and privacy? But specifically Russia, I mean, if you look at their IMF template over the last year, they haven't been sitting still. They've raised their liquidity profile. They've sold securities. They haven't bought gold because, let's face it, gold is demonetized and it's the most illiquid form of reserve asset. In fact, I think it was the reserve manager for the Bank of Russia who said in March of 2020, faced with the dollar crisis, we're not buying any more gold because it doesn't do us any good. So the Russians have been changing the liquidity profile. They've been stocking more in deposits with foreign central banks and foreign governments. And I got to believe that's not the American government or the Federal Reserve. That's not the Bank of England. I'm thinking they've changed their deposits around so that they're arranged with Switzerland or India or China, perhaps. So, confiscation isn't, again, it's not so simple as US authorities come in and say, that account, that's the Bank of Russia, I'm confiscating it. This Eurodollar decentralized network that spreads the whole world allows for a lot of different places to not hide assets, but maintain workable level of correspondent relationships where you can still operate even if US authorities don't like you operating on the system. It's not the US authority system. It's decentralized, at least in that respect.
Right. So I think, so even if there is a push to, so basically they can control some of those dollars, but they won't always get all of them. So there'll always be workarounds, is what you're saying.
The example I used yesterday was the two banks at the Treasury Department, the two big Russian banks, the Treasury Department singled out for exactly this kind of maneuver. They're not seizing asset, but what they said was in 30 days, VTB and Sberbank, if you're a US financial institution, you have to sever all relationships with them. No more correspondent accounts, no more payable through accounts, right? But that's US banks. The Eurodollar system is hundreds and hundreds of banks all over the world. So even if the US and Europe and some of the other countries get involved and say, yes, we're going to sanction these two big Russian banks in the same way that the Treasury Department has said, there's still a huge part of the Eurodollar network that they can still access, including the chip system, which means they don't even need to send Swift messages. They can send CHIPS messages for payment requests. So, cutting somebody out of the dollar system, that's one of the reasons why the Eurodollar system grew and expanded as much as it did, because it allows this form of flexibility and pliability when needed. That's maybe one of the positive attributes to it. The downside of it is, of course, in a decentralized system, you end up with something like 2008.
Yes. So, yeah, no, I think in some ways we just have to, I wrote a piece about around the Canadian trucker time about how the FATF rules on money laundering, we've put them in, I think, in good faith, and we all want to like control bad practice, and I get the whole concept, but I think what that has manifested over time is that actually they're not very effective, these FATF things, and the real problem is corruption at the top level. And if you can this has been a lifelong problem for economies, because even like in Roman times, if you could pay people off, if you could pay them off, they will let you in. And I think that is the bigger problem, and that's much harder to control with rules and regulations. Corruption is sort of, it is a dark horse that is, and as Soviet example, whatever, when we descend into corrupt societies, that's the real kind of that is the death knell of civilization, in my opinion, because that is when trust is completely abandoned itself.
But that's what law is supposed to be about, to make sure that if you're doing something that's illegal or something that's immoral, I mean, I don't want to mix the two, but if you're doing something like that, you're supposed to be put in jail, right? That's the corrective mechanism. Because you're right, people who have money are always going to do what people who have money have done throughout human history. The problem isn't the money or the form of money. The problem is the people, right? And so we're supposed to have the system that corrects personal behavior when it steps outside outside the lines. The issue isn't the form of money that they're using to do bad things, because people always do bad things, right? The biggest financer of illicit affairs, whether it be drugs or whatever throughout the world right now, is physical Federal Reserve notes. Drug dealers deal in physical cash because that's the medium that allows them to do what they do. And if they couldn't use physical cash, they would use some other form of money, because they're criminals. They do what criminals do. It's not the money that we need to blame. It's the fact that we're not catching them and we're not putting them in jail to stop that activity.
I think, one thing I think of now with Bitcoin, especially, one thing that I've come to kind of concede on with Bitcoin is I think it's an important countermeasure that can keep the core system honest. So I think as a pushback mechanism, whether it becomes the dominant system or not, I'm not sure it's a good idea for it to be the dominant system at all. But I agree with you, maybe later on, but as it stands, no. But I think that the world is better off for it being here. Now, the downside of that argument is that obviously it can facilitate terrible, transactions potentially, although the ledger is quite transparent. So theoretically, that can be also chased quite easily. But I was thinking it's kind of like a dual use technology, which is a term that we're now learning with gain of function, so the technology itself is neutral. It's how it's deployed. If it's deployed for positive, it's great. It can maintain freedom. It can protect people. It can facilitate transactions, whatever. But if it's deployed for bad, it can do terrible things. So it's really about the morality of the people who are using it rather than the technology itself. That's the problem. And I think maybe the FATF rulings have to realize that it's more complex, basically.
Well, it's also compartmentalized, right? It's that the people who are chasing money laundering are chasing people who do money laundering. And so their focus is, how do we stop that criminal activity? They don't have a wide 30,000 foot focus on, is this system the cause of this illicit activity, or is it just contributing to it, or is it just, that's what just happens? So law enforcement that's trying to chase money laundering, that's what they're doing. And so they're saying, we need to shut down all these avenues without thinking about the systemic issues behind them. And I think that's probably an issue of society at large. With all of these kind of complex questions that we have, we live in a very complex society nowadays. It's hard, going back to, why do we have so many experts on TV telling us what to think, is because it's very hard for regular folks to stay on top of all of these complex issues. In some ways, we have to trust that there are experts who know what they're talking about, so that we don't have to analyze evidence over every complex topic there is, including money, including war, including all these other things like crime and punishment. So, any successful monetary system, we don't blame the monetary system if people are abusing it, because people are always going to abuse whatever system's available. That should not be the criteria here. The criteria here should be, again, money isn't wealth. It's a tool for commercial transaction. And so if commercial transactions are fluid, are able to take place in a fluid and efficient manner because the monetary system works, that should be our criteria. And if there are people who abuse it, there's always going to be people who abuse it. That's just the way it is.
And I was listening to this Ukrainian lady last night, and she was saying, "Oh, well, I'm a lawyer, and if I would never do business with anyone if I knew my business was empowering." And I hear her point, but she was trying to make a point about financing of obviously Russian activities, and how whoever does it is immoral, right? But
should we feel guilty because we bought a Russian product, right? I mean,
yes, exactly.
I think that's taking it way too far.
I've heard examples of debanking Russian people. So,
yes,
I understand government functions. That seems legitimate. But now there's dictates or suggestions. Well, if you're Russian, we're going to debank you. What?
It's terrible. I mean, I genuinely think this whole talk about xenophobia. We've been conditioned to not be xenophobic through these last few years, but there's been such a sort of Russiaphobia suddenly, and we have to differentiate. As we say with China, you have to differentiate between the CCP and the people of China, and the same applies to Russia. I'm no fan of Putin at all. I'm Polish. I have never, but and his regime, but there are good Russians. You can't just we're all losers in war at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's what I wrote yesterday. The people of Russia as well as the people of Ukraine are going to end up bearing the brunt of this. The people of Ukraine obviously more directly in loss of life and the tragedy there, but with the ruble collapsing, the economy being bad in Russia going all the way back to 2011 and 2008, I mean, the Russian people are going to suffer the consequences of Putin's arrogance too. And there are no winners here. That's the problem. There are no winners here. I think that should start to trigger some people's thinking about why is this? I mean, why would this guy do this? I mean, what's really wrong here? And it's not necessarily just Russia and Ukraine or NATO expansion, all that stuff, the history or the post-war era. I think there's, what Emil and I talk about a lot, this mass formation psychosis or, free-floating anxiety. People don't have a lot of answers because they can tell something is wrong. Something went wrong around 2008 and it's never really been fixed. And it's leading to all these more and more frequent and more extreme examples of the world breaking itself apart, which if you step back and look at the world human civilization historically, this is kind of what happens. We go through eras of globalization. Emil knows more about this than anybody. We go through these periods of globalization based on monetary conditions. It starts to fall apart, it breaks apart, and then we deglobalize, which leads to all sorts of nasty consequences. And it really, because our experts can't explain what's happening to people, because a lot of them don't really know. They're just credentialed, highly educated office seekers. They're not really experts. People have no answers. But in the good, let's bring this back to our opening discussion. That's good for people like you, Izabella, because now you have an open door and a potential platform to fill in all these enormous gaps and say, this is what you're not being told. And yes, maybe you don't like this perspective, but I think you should probably listen to it, if no other reason than to challenge what you think.
Well, I think that is very important. And I think you need to have a kind of, like I said, a dispassionate view of things. And that's not to say that you can't, analyze things and try and kind of interpret things in a way that kind of helps your side. But that is, but I think you can't just shut it out.
I think you have to be conscious of that bias, right? I mean, you probably more than, I don't know how you could be a straight J, a journalist, knowing that you have biases, but you always have to be constantly aware of them. That seems like a really hard job.
Well, I think, the BBC is a very good example where a lot of people are leaving the BBC because they are so mandate driven at the neutrality that it's like you have to become a priest to join the journalistic cause at the BBC, because you're not allowed to have a political opinion at all. And so you have to have a poker face the entire time. And I think that is just not, you can't live that way. I couldn't live that way. That is a calling of it. Like, and also in this day and age, who at the age of like 20, when they're joining like their profession, hasn't already like made their biases known on the social media system? Like, you can't come in without priors. So I think, unless you pledge a vow of poverty, and make yourself like, literally you have to become a monk to become a properly neutral, like no one, like a Jedi or whatever. Unless you're prepared to do that, I don't think you can be neutral. And therefore and I don't want to do that. I'm not that much of a, I'm keen to like, do everything I can for clarity and truth, but I also want to have a nice-ish life. I think the only alternative is being transparent about your biases and trying to keep them in check, and wake up every morning and think, what if I'm wrong? Analyze the pros and cons, and then sometimes you'll have a change of heart, and then sometimes you won't, and sometimes you'll have a change back, but that I think is the only rational way to operate right now, personally.
Izabella, tell the audience where finance, economy, media intersects with reality.
At the moment, or more broadly, I think at the moment it's about cutting through the propaganda, frankly, and seeing the real picture of where the money is flowing. I think the money flow, as just bringing it back to the Eurodollar, that is a signal in and of itself that is hard to disguise. And when that's what I mean by the reality reference in that slug line, is that eventually you can't suppress it. Like, the reality always says hello, right? So you can deny it, but eventually, if you deny it for too long, the fall when you have to face up to reality is all the bigger. So that's what I'm trying to avoid. I'm trying to ease people into the reality that they're maybe not they're blinkered from, because I'm doing it for their own good. It's like when you try and tell a child, you're trying to like shift them into sort of realizing that X is, this is a thing. Like, I'm sorry, it's not nice, but it happens. I think that's what I mean. And I think for finance, it's very important. But what do you think?
Well, I think people should go to Twitter at Kaminska, or at The Blind Spot with a 0 instead of an O, and the-blindspot.com. That's what I think. Jeff, any final questions?
Final questions? No, I think that, I think it's great to see the proliferation of voices, as the legacy media sort of restricts itself to what they think the public should get, or the information the public should have. I like seeing, especially you, Izzy, and other people around the world who are saying, no, we need to do this a different way. And I'm going to put myself at risk, my own personal risk. I'm going to go outside of where I've been for a very long time, made a name for myself. I'm going to put myself on the line to try to add to public discourse. Yes, there's some self-interest in doing this, of course. But yeah, I think that, especially you in particular, there's a bit of altruism here in the old traditional spirit of journalism, where it's, yes, I have these biases, but darn it, you should listen to this other person who doesn't believe what I believe. Giving people what people really need to hear, which is a wide breadth of information.
Yes, I mean, just to in the name of neutrality, I will just say that the critics would say that being too open-minded to a sinister, malevolent force allows like a Trojan horse to be embedded in your brain, and that's the reality of open systems.
And that's too cynical. That is way too cynical to look at people and say, I'm going to give you all the information and I don't trust you to decide what's good for you.